Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Independent Sage Weekly Briefing. I'm Alok Jha, I'm a science journalist. This week, the government finally announced that it will offer vaccinations to all children aged between 12 and 15. Now, while this is welcome news, infection rates in the UK still remain very high. And as Independent Sage has repeatedly warned, the more coronavirus there is in circulation, the more likely it is that a vaccine-resistant variant might well develop. Today, we're going to be just focusing on vaccines and variants. And to join the discussion, we've got two guest experts. Professor Aris Katsorakis, Professor of Evolution and Genomics at the University of Oxford, and Dr. Deepti Gurdasani, who's a clinical epidemiologist and senior lecturer in machine learning at Queen Mary University of London. And they'll kick off the discussion that will be led by Professor Dinan Pillay. Before we begin this topic, we're going to ask Professor Christina Pagel to give us the latest figures. Christina, over to you.
Hi. So short numbers today. I hope everyone can see that. So I'm going to start with hospitalizations and deaths this week, then vaccinations, and then just finish on cases and look at particularly cases in children. So hospitalizations and deaths. So yes, cases are coming down, hospitalizations aren't. They are now coming down in Northern Ireland, which is good, but they were incredibly high there. Scotland and Wales are still going up steeply, reflecting that they had really big increases in cases a week or two ago. And the UK, England, sorry, even though cases have been flat or falling, hospitalizations are gradually going up. And that's because if you get the same number of admissions every day, they stay quite a while, about a week in hospital, and it just means that it builds up. And that has consequences because COVID patients are often quite sick patients. This is actually just looking at the number of critical care beds in England each day by type of patient. So red is patients with COVID, yellow is all other patients, and grey is unoccupied beds. And you can see that basically since July, we've had high levels of critical care occupancy by COVID patients, and that will impact all other care that the NHS can give. About a fifth of all critical care beds are currently occupied by patients with COVID, and that means that we can't do as many elective operations as we want. It means we don't have the resources to do all the other work that the NHS needs to do. Looking at deaths, they have stayed about the same for the last 3 weeks, or about 130 deaths a day is what we're reporting. Over 6,500 people have died since the 1st of July. And yes, this is a lot lower than it was at the peak, but it's still high and still 6 times higher than it was a year ago before the vaccine. So talking of vaccines, I'm just going to show you this, this one slide, which is coverage by dose. So light blue is first dose, dark blue is second dose, and by age. So you can see we do have really good coverage in older adults. And now what is good, we're starting to see that in younger adults too. So a lot of 20-somethings have now had their second dose of vaccine, and they've had it for a couple of weeks. And I do think this is contributing to the fact that cases in these age groups, as we'll see, has fallen quite a lot. I do think it's a lot of vaccine protections kicking in because the vaccines work really well in younger people. And we're also seeing now good uptake in 16 and 17-year-olds who've had a few weeks of being able to get the vaccine. Almost 60% have had a first dose, and it's something like 67% in Scotland. So this is cases, the number of people who've had a positive test up to the 15th of September. I'm not showing yesterday's data because there wasn't any Scottish case data yesterday. But cases have dropped a little bit, quite a lot actually, over the last week, and have been about 30,000 a day this week. If we look at it by nation, this is now by date of test, so it only goes up to the 11th of September. You can see that cases are flat or falling in all nations, particularly Scotland is coming down, which is really good because they were incredibly high. But actually, this is hiding kind of differences in testing. So if we look at Northern Ireland, which looks like it's falling the least, actually they've had extremely dramatic drops in their positivity rate. So that's the proportion of people tested who test positive. So this suggests Northern Ireland is having a big testing campaign, which is good. It's finding lots of cases, and that's why their numbers look relatively high, but they're actually on a good downward trajectory. Scotland and Wales positivity rates are coming down, although Wales is still like really high, over 15%. England has been flat all summer, really, at about 8%. Kind of a very gradual drop over the last week, but it's kind of hard to read too much into our falling cases because positivity has been so flat. So just looking at children, so just trying to understand a little bit more about where cases are happening. And this is now looking at England in particular. And this is from Public Health England's weekly surveillance report that was released yesterday, and they show kind of case rates over the last week around England. So one thing just to highlight is that the Southwest is now falling away again after holiday and festival season. The North has still got higher rates than the South, which we've seen consistently throughout the pandemic. But right in the middle, there's this very dark splodge, and that's Leicestershire and Leicester right in the middle. Now, there could be various reasons for this, and we know that Leicester has often had some of the highest case rates in England, but schools in Leicestershire went back on the 23rd of August, so they go back about 10 days earlier than the rest of England. And so if we look at case rates by age in Leicestershire, and this includes Leicester to the 11th of September, this red line is 10 to 14-year-olds, this orange line is 5 to 9-year-olds, and this yellow line is 15 to 19-year-olds. This is when schools went back, and you can see that since then, cases have really accelerated in school-aged children, particularly 5 to 15-year-olds. And it kind of took a week or two before it really started going up, whereas case rates in other age groups are flat or falling, particularly in this 20 to 29-year-old group, where I do think the vaccine protection is now really starting to kick in. So the question is whether Leicester is just a couple of weeks ahead of the rest of England. And we've seen already that case rates in school-aged children are really high in Scotland. We looked at that last week, although they are starting to come down a bit there now. If we look at England, this is all of England. These are the 15 to 19-year-olds, this yellow spike. So this is kind of Euros end of term spike in July. This is kind of festival season in August. This looks like a kind of back to school spike for some of them that's now coming down. But 10 to 14-year-olds and 5 to 9-year-olds have definitely gone up since the start of term and are currently high and flat, whereas cases in 20 to 29-year-olds have dropped quite a lot, and cases in 30 to 59-year-olds are also flat or falling, as is the case for 60 plus. So although overall cases are kind of flat or falling in England, they are still high and going up in school-aged children. And we can see that it's not just a question of testing. This is the positivity rates by age group. This is slightly different age brackets, so 10 to 19 and 0 to 9. And you can see they're the only age groups where positivity rates are high and going up. And they're coming down significantly in 20 to 29-year-olds and are flat in the other age groups. So we are seeing that cases have now shifted effectively to our school-aged children. So just to summarize, cases and positivity rates are falling in all nations, mostly in the most steep decline in Northern Ireland and flattest in England. Cases are high and flat or rising in school-aged children, and they're falling in young adults, and they're kind of flat in the over 60s. Leicestershire schools went back on the 23rd of August and are seeing really soaring case rates in children, over 1.5% testing positive every week at the moment. Hospitalizations are going up in Scotland and Wales, are flat in England and reducing in Northern Ireland. But in all places, they're about 10 times higher than they were a year ago. And although overall, I think COVID patients are about 5% of current hospital occupancy, they're 20% of our critical care capacity. And that's being used to treat COVID patients. And that is placing quite a significant burden on the NHS. And finally, despite vaccination, we still have almost 1,000 people dying each week in England within 28 days of a positive COVID test. And that is 6 times higher than a year ago. And, I don't want that to become our new normal. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Christina. We're going to now go over to Professor Deenan Pillay, who's going to begin our discussion on the variants and introduce our special guests. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Alec, and thank you, Christina, for that. So we're delighted to welcome Aris Katsarakis and also Deepti Gurdasani to the panel today. Both have demonstrated their expertise and insights during the whole pandemic from their perspective and their position of expertise, and they will join us, and we will be asking them some focus questions, but then also they're part of the panel to answer questions from the public and press. So thank you both, Aris and Deepti, for making the time to join us. If I might just start with a question or two to Aris. So Aris is a professor of evolution and genetics, and of course, but has focused on, in particular, the evolution and genetics of viruses, a whole range of viruses. And so you're ideally placed, Aris, to give us your views on where next for Delta. We have now all become familiar with the concept of viruses evolving, of mutations developing, and those mutations having an impact in terms of maybe infectivity, disease, and also, of course, response to protection by vaccines. So Delta seems to have been around for a while now. Have you got any thoughts about where next?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to answer this kind of question with absolute certainty, but we can certainly use the lens of evolutionary biology to highlight some possibilities and some risks and potential directions. I mean, we've seen several variants of concern over the pandemic. We've seen more transmissible variants. We've seen ones that are able to escape immunity slightly better. Delta seems to combine these to some extent. It's by far the most transmissible variant we've seen so far, and with some degree of immune escape. And it's now dominated the landscape, and essentially soon it's quite likely that it's going to be the globally dominant variant. It's quite possible that the next variant that might challenge our public health response even further will be birthed from Delta itself, because it's so dominant across the world. And we may see more transmissible variants. We may see variants with other distinct characteristics in terms of pathology. But of course, the major concern globally now is what's going to happen in terms of vaccine escape. Delta has shown some degree of escape from vaccines. Even for double vaccinated patients, there is some degree of escape with regards to transmission. Of course, protection against serious disease is holding up very strong so far. We will see potentially more escape from transmission, potentially eventually even some degree of escape from severity of symptoms, although it's impossible to know that for sure. But there are many unknowns, and of course, the higher the prevalence of the virus, the bigger the possibility of an escape variant that will challenge our response further. And as vaccines are rolled out, there is an added selection pressure on the virus in order to adapt to the vaccines that we're using to control it.
Thanks very much for that answer. So that would follow on to a next question. We'll sort of focus a bit more on vaccines with Deepti, but there's been talk right from the beginning about the potential need for updating vaccines, having variant-specific vaccine. Well, of course, the vaccine itself is variant-specific. The original Wuhan strain, of course, that's what it's based on. But there seems to be a debate whether in response to vaccines, there's a broad immune response that is likely to also protect mainly, a whole variety of variants, versus the idea that we may need to have regular vaccines, each of which is updated to the latest variant in the same paradigm that we have with flu. Have you got any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, with the proviso that there are a lot of unknowns here, and obviously the discussion around boosters and potential variant boosters is a very complex one and involves lots of interacting issues. But specifically around Delta specific boosters, in terms of protection from severe disease, we're probably going to be okay with a booster to the Wuhan strain for now. But how long that will last for is unknown. There may eventually be a variant that will escape with regards to severe disease and will require variant-specific boosters. But we're already at a stage where we have substantial escape from transmission for Delta. And I think a lot of people's thinking, and mine included, is that an update to Delta would give us an easy win against the virus with regards to controlling transmission. Because of course, it's great that these vaccines protect us from serious disease, but the fact that they also protect against transmission greatly facilitates public health responses and requires less invasive non-pharmaceutical interventions. So if we were to update to a Delta-specific booster and control transmission better, there would be less need for the other measures that periodically come in and influence our lives in order to, of course, control the disease and regulate disease more generally.
Great, that's really good and a nice introduction to, I'm sure, questions that will follow. And thanks for being here, and please be willing to answer other questions from the public and the press. So thanks, Aris. And if I pass over to Zubaida to introduce Deepti again and launch in some questions.
Thank you very much, Aris. Well, I am delighted. We are delighted to have Dr. Deepti Gurdasani with us today. Huge fan of all her work. She's been working really hard during this pandemic, talking about clinical epidemiology, which is her background. She also has a medical degree in internal medicine, but really talking about children vaccinations in schools. And that's what we're here to talk about today, really, which is, as we know, this week we had the much awaited decision from Professor Chris Whitty, our CMO, about whether children get vaccinated or not. He, if you like, slightly did a U-turn from JCVI's decision earlier this month and said that actually we will be vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds. Not sure if many of you can remember, but at the beginning of the month, we were waiting for JCVI to make that decision, partly because some 14 million children across the world, 14 million teenagers across the world have been vaccinated, but we haven't yet vaccinated children in England. We've been waiting for that decision, but JCVI decided not to give permission for that rollout because they said there was only a marginal benefit to vaccinating healthy 12 to 15-year-olds. But as I've said, Chris Whitty has now recommended that we go ahead based on the fact that it will reduce children's disruption to children's education. But Dr. Gurdasani, I think the public will be quite confused because JCVI are saying there's only a marginal benefit, and actually in their minds, it wasn't worth rolling out the vaccination for 12 to 15-year-olds. Professor Chris Whitty said, look, let's go ahead because it will reduce school disruption. Are there no clinical benefits to vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds?
So I'm really concerned about the messaging. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Yes, you can. Okay. The messaging around the benefits to children and vaccination. I mean, there seems to be a real misunderstanding here about the impacts, first of all, of COVID on children. I mean, we constantly hear that the impacts on children are non-severe, and a lot of that is based on a comparison with adults. And while children probably suffer from severe illness less than adults do, that doesn't mean that the impact on them is in any way insignificant. And it's interesting, the JCVI analysis, which still has not been published, so it's very hard to scrutinize. But while it separated out children who are healthy and children with pre-existing conditions, it did not include one of the major impacts on children, which is long COVID. I mean, there's a very large-scale study that was published recently that suggests that 1 in 7 children, which is a very significant number of children, go on to have persisting symptoms after infection for up to 15 weeks. I mean, that is a lot for one infection to do. And it's quite puzzling that while there has been a lot of focus on theoretical, hypothetical, long-term harms from vaccines, which are very, very unlikely to materialize after 3 to 4 months for any vaccine. And even the known risks are very rare and typically mild. There has been almost no consideration at all of even the known risks of the virus, far less the unknown future risks of the virus. So, let's just talk about the direct impact on children. So let's remember, first of all, that the exposure to children currently is huge. The choice is not between vaccination and children don't get infected. Right now, if you're not getting vaccinated, you are going to get infected. Just look at the last 2 weeks. If you look at the Public Health England data, in 10 to 19-year-olds, 80,000 children were infected in 2 weeks alone. If you even consider that 5% of those children go on to develop long-term symptoms, that's 4,000 children in 2 weeks alone. And 2,000 of those could have been prevented by vaccination, because another myth is that vaccines don't help with long COVID. The point is vaccines prevent infection, not completely, but to a pretty good extent, by about 50 to 60%. And if they prevent infection, and if you don't get infected, then you can't get long COVID. So those things were not considered by the JCVI. The JCVI felt it was cautious to delay vaccination while we awaited more data on this, which is quite surprising given, as you mentioned, more than 14 million teenagers have been vaccinated across the world, 10 million in the US alone. We are an outlier in Europe. So if you look at France, Italy, Denmark, more than half the adolescents have received at least one dose. And in Italy and France, it's about 50% have been vaccinated fully. And the MHRA, which is a regulatory body which decides whether vaccines are safe or effective, authorized vaccination on 4th of June, since when hundreds of thousands of adolescents have been infected. And for them, this could have prevented long COVID from any hospitalizations. So let's even talk about hospitalizations. 1 in 200 children right now who are cases of COVID, who, not infections, but confirmed cases, are getting hospitalized. We are having about 40 hospitalizations in under 18s with COVID every single day. That's not trivial. We've had about 1,000 children hospitalizations every month for the last 3 months. And at the peak, we were having 300 kids hospitalized every week. And we are very likely going to get there. I mean, just looking at the Office for National Statistics data, we have 1 in 37 secondary school age children right now who have infection. That's one kid, probably per 1 or 2 classrooms. And it's likely to rise. Like Christina said, it takes 2 or 3 weeks for these things to gain momentum. And we've really missed that golden opportunity of summer to protect our children, which is why infection is dropping in other groups that have been vaccinated, but rising among children who will now have to face the consequence of infection, which is going to be, sadly, some getting hospitalized, many developing long COVID, and very sadly, some will die. And all of these are preventable. And the message that's sadly being given to parents and all this is that there's no direct impact to your children from vaccination, but they should get vaccinated to reduce anxiety, educational disruption, and impact on others. Whereas the direct benefit to children is extremely clear and very important. And I think this sort of juggling between the JCVI and the CMOs, which is probably meant to sort of save face or whatever, I really, really worry about the impact that's going to have on vaccine hesitancy. And I think it's completely reckless that this opportunity to protect children has been missed.
Thank you. Well, let's go back to the fact that it feels like we've sort of dragged JCVI and the CMO to this position, because I think while there will be many parents out there who will be relieved that their children might be getting the vaccination, will be getting the vaccination now, especially if they're teenagers. And we know that there is strong parental support, of course, for vaccinating teenagers as well as under 11-year-olds. I think a lot of parents will be quite confused about the fact that the CMO, our CMO and CMOs across the board have only said that children will be receiving 1 dose. What's it about, Deepti? And will that be enough? Will that be enough to reduce educational disruption? Will it be enough to reduce long COVID? Will it be enough to protect grandparents?
So it's really concerning. So again, the 1-dose policy is an outlier. If you look at almost every country across the world, US, Canada, countries in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, almost all countries in Europe, perhaps except Norway and Sweden are offering 2 doses of vaccines to all children. And while the JCVI seems to be once again concerned about the very rare effect of vaccine-associated myocarditis, which is more common after the second dose, particularly in boys, you need to remember, if you don't give 2 doses, you might reduce those rare and typically mild side effects, but you also reduce the huge benefits from vaccines. And the fact is that we don't really know the effectiveness of 1 dose of vaccines in adolescents or anybody else long term. I mean, what we know with 2 doses and Delta is that immunity wanes over time significantly, and it's very, very unlikely that 1 dose over long periods of time will be sufficient in preventing infection, which is what you need to do to prevent things like long COVID, which occurs, in healthy young children. So it's very unclear to me what sort of analysis of risk benefit or evidence this is based on, because there's certainly no evidence that we have on a single dose of vaccine, the protection it will be able to provide and for how long. But the benefit of 2 doses is very, very clear and has been recapitulated, by the CDC and countries all over the world that frankly have vaccinated millions of children with 2 doses. And we are seeing the impacts of that. In the US, for example, it's very clear that children who are vaccinated have about 10 times lower risk of hospitalization than those who are unvaccinated. And we need to remember that actually, we talk about vaccine-associated myocarditis, but COVID itself causes damage to multiple organs in the body, even in people with mild symptoms. I mean, we see this even in young adults who, for example, develop thinning of the brain after 6 months. We see effects on their kidneys with reduction in kidney function over 5 to 6 months after the acute infection. It's very likely that this also happens in children, but it's not really been studied much. And if you want to prevent these long-term effects, essentially, we can't expose children to infection. And we are doing that by putting them into crowded classrooms with almost no mitigations in place and sadly unvaccinated, when the global evidence is telling us that that is completely unsafe. And we know that the impact of COVID on the heart, kidney, lung, and brain are for the longer term.
Thank you. So actually, you partially answered this question, but I was going to ask you, given, as Professor Katsarakis has mentioned, we're dealing with a different variant here, the Delta variant, which has really changed the game on us. Given that context, it's not just a question of is 1 dose is enough. Do you think just having vaccines is enough? Can we just have vaccines and remove all other mitigations in schools, and will teenagers be fine? And will all children be fine?
No, that's very unlikely. In fact, we're seeing that even in places where children are being vaccinated. I mean, certainly it helps, but you need multi-layered mitigations. We need to remember that children have had the highest infection rates in this pandemic post-Delta in, I would say, most countries across the world. I mean, and we're seeing the same patterns in England and Scotland here. And even with multi-layered mitigations, it's very, very hard to control Delta in environments that are crowded, where lots of people come together. And vaccines don't confer 100% protection. They will definitely help. They reduce transmission, but we need other mitigations like masks, ventilation, that have been completely ignored largely in England. We need bubbles. We need good contact tracing in schools. I think it's incredible that if I get COVID today, my daughter can go into a classroom being exposed to me day in and day out and infect other people. Similarly, if there's a case in a classroom sitting right next to her, she won't even be informed. And we're seeing huge outbreaks in schools as a result at the moment. So vaccines are definitely part of the whole picture, but in of themselves, they're not going to be sufficient to be able to keep schools open. And the people who talk about the huge impacts of educational disruption and school closures should be actively advocating for mitigations in schools and for vaccination of children to make it possible to keep schools open.
Thank you. Now, I have got a cue to move on, but I do have one very, very last question. If the chair would allow, Chair Pillay, Professor Pillay, please, I have one tiny quick question, which was on everybody's minds, which is, what about if your children are younger than age 12? What about the 5 to 11-year-olds? Should we, so that we don't, so that JCVI doesn't get stunned by this issue when it occurs, should we be vaccinating 5 to 11-year-olds? And if you don't mind, Dr. Gurdasani, if you could just give us a quick answer for that, please.
Yeah, sure. So the AAP, which is the American Academy of Pediatrics, has been pushing very hard for that to happen because sadly they're seeing a lot of severe illness in that group because of very high rates of infection. And I believe that Pfizer is submitting a report to regulators from the very recent trials in that age group and are hoping to get approval quickly. I know many countries are very keen to start rolling out the vaccine to that age group. Israel, in fact, has already started rolling out the vaccine to vulnerable members of that age group because they were concerned about the potential severity of disease given the high rates that they're seeing. I honestly hope that we don't have to go through the same process of delay and dither while thousands of children get ill once again. And I hope that the JCVI this time will take a more rational and evidence-based approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Back to you. Back to you, Alok.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. That was a fascinating discussion. We're now going to go straight to questions from members of the press and the public. So let's start with Nigel Nelson from the Sunday Mirror. Nigel, are you there? Nigel, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, but I can't get my video working.
Okay, you can ask a question anyway.
All right. Thanks, Alec. Anyway, yeah, later on this afternoon, that Grant Shapps is likely to announce that PCR tests will no longer be required for travellers coming into the country and will be replaced by lateral flow tests. Now, as I understand it, the best way to detect incoming variants is genome sequencing of PCRs, which you can't do with lateral flows. So the question is this good enough now to detect incoming variants, given that, I mean, there will be a PCR test after a positive lateral flow, but is that enough?
Very good question. I think Aris maybe, and Dinan as well, both of you can take this, mate. Dinan, why don't you start?
Okay, thanks, Nigel. It's clearly a very pertinent, and we await that guidance. On the one hand, my view is, yes, I mean, the ability, you're absolutely right, the ability to undertake genetic sequencing does depend on swabs being taken for PCR. It's part of the same process. But having said that, this is, a very personal view, is that the way that testing on return from travel has been set up with a whole range of, I don't know if any of you, whether you've ever had to go online and pick one of these companies that you've got to, register with in order to fill in your passenger location form to come back, it has just been a complete disaster. Many of them seem to be fraudulent organizations. Some of them are now starting to be banned. And I would have thought that there's been a huge ineffectiveness of that process precisely because of the way it's been set up. So I would prefer, I think it is important that testing continues widely. I would prefer it is undertaken by the NHS. In these days where, of course, there's many reasons to travel. It's not everyone going off like Dominic Raab to go on paddle boards. We do need to. If there is a commitment to open up borders as the government wants, then part and parcel of that is a good NHS system which allows this to be done without having people having to pay for it, without people having to wait long periods of time before they can release from quarantine and so forth. So that would be my view as a solution to this problem.
Aris, did you want to add anything there about tracking variants? Because I think that is an interesting thing we do need to be doing at some point.
Yeah, I mean, yes, PCR is better in terms of tracking variants. There could be systems built in with a cascade of tests where you have lateral flow followed by PCR, or you could have samples taken for variants specifically. I think I would echo what Professor Pillay is saying, in that it's the deployment of tests that's been absolutely crucial and hasn't quite been up to scratch. I mean, PCR might be a better diagnostic than lateral flow, but if you get your day 2 testing results 5 or 6 days after you've arrived in the UK, even though it's a better test, that's no use, because you may have been here positive, not required to quarantine, and spreading the virus, with a much better test telling you that you're positive a few days later, but not actually having the commensurate public health benefits. So I think the actual deployment of the test is absolutely crucial, perhaps more so than the specifics of the actual diagnostic itself.
Susan.
Thanks. Well, this is a question, because some countries have lateral flows, but you have to go into a centre and have it done professionally and pay a small amount for it. And my question is, do we know what the reliability, validity of people doing this themselves compared to going into a centre is? Because I can imagine that certain groups in society might be quite motivated not to get a positive result when they do a lateral flow themselves. The other issue is, a good idea if you get a positive test result to then go on to a PCR. But it would seem to me that if you get a positive test result, that PCR should be free, because then if it's not free, then that really is an incentivization for people not to get a positive lateral flow test.
It's a good question. Dean, you seem to have a lot of thoughts on this.
Very briefly, I can speak from personal experience of in order to, in the days when you could have a day 5 test after travel abroad to release yourself from quarantine, I paid, I think, 150 quid for the privilege of actually going to a place, but I picked up a kit and was told to go into one of these booths and do it myself. And I was sorely tempted to wiggle the swab around my ear, to be honest, because what's the incentive to show that you're positive? I did, of course, do it properly. I did gag myself, but to think that this is a way to protect the public is nonsense.
I meant going to centres where a professional does it for you, because that's what's done in other countries.
Unless someone has some data on that, I haven't seen any data on that either. It would be interesting to see. Shall we move on to the question? More questions from the public. So, Donna McNaughton, you have a question. Would you like to ask it?
Yeah, my question's about the children again. My children are 12 and 14 and had COVID during the summer holidays. In light of Chris Whitty saying there's only marginal gains from the vaccination, will they still benefit from being vaccinated, or will they already have sufficient or equivalent natural immunity?
So maybe I can try and answer that initially.
Please.
So, there's very good evidence now, at least from adults, that even those with previous COVID-19 infection will benefit greatly in terms of their immunity, the quality of the immunity and the durability of the immunity with vaccination. This is even more important with Delta, because immunity against previous variants may not confer immunity against Delta because it's so different and is able to escape from natural immunity to an extent to previous variants. And it's particularly important, not just in protection of severe disease, but protection of infection, which is the most important thing in preventing long COVID, which sadly is common in the age group that you're describing. So, I would certainly say that there are benefits directly to children, and they are not marginal. And as I said before, JCVI has not considered the most common impact on kids from COVID, which is long COVID, which can happen to anybody, including healthy children. So I would certainly say, even if you've had an infection before, getting a vaccination would certainly improve the level of immunity, which would confer much greater protection, particularly in light of the very high exposure that children are experiencing to the Delta variant in classrooms right now.
Would anyone else like to add to that? It's very nicely answered. There's another question about children from Phil Goodwin. Why don't we go to you, Phil?
Hi, this is about a question about vaccinating boys aged 12 to 15. So I'm a parent of a 13-year-old, and I was worried as I've seen that the boys are at slightly higher risk than girls for the vaccine-associated myocarditis. If the marginal benefit finding was for all children, could that mean that the boys might have little or no benefit, whilst the girls' risk to benefit ratio pulls that up to marginal? Or do boys and girls independently both see benefit from the vaccine?
It's a very good question. Deepti, I reckon you can probably answer this. I just wanted to know if anyone else has a thought too. Do put your hand up. But Deepti, why don't you go first?
Sure. So that's true. So for boys, the risk of myocarditis with, let's say, 2 doses of vaccines is about 66 per million. And for girls, it's about 9 to 10 per million. And, we can look at the benefits and the risks in those two groups separately, which actually we have done. And what we found is that the direct benefit, even if you look at boys and girls separately, to boys in terms of, preventing hospitalization, preventing long COVID, preventing ICU admissions and deaths, is still much, much, much greater than the rare complication of myocarditis, unless you reach very, very low sustainable rates of infection that are sort of below 50 per 100,000 per week. To put that in context, our current rate in that age group is about 700 per 100,000 per week. So that's more than 10 times higher. So unless infection rates were to drop to much lower levels, even then there would be a much greater benefit in terms of long COVID, but the hospitalizations from myocarditis would become sort of balanced with the hospitalizations due to COVID. Having said that, I also want to say that COVID can cause myocarditis as well. And there's emerging evidence that that might be more common with COVID than with vaccination, although it's something that's hard to kind of do robust research on. But we know, for example, that in under 16, COVID-related myocarditis is about 37 times more common in those who are infected versus those who are not infected among patients who've been seen in hospitals, so not a general cohort. So I would certainly say there are very clear benefits even for boys until a much lower threshold. In girls, of course, that threshold of balance becomes lower than for boys, if you understand what I mean.
Zubaida.
I think that the really puzzling thing with JCVI's decision is they appear to look at children as a homogenous group, which is really strange given that we know adults are not a homogenous group, so they looked at adults in terms of vulnerability, and vaccines were rolled out in terms of who was vulnerable first and who was more vulnerable and so on. But when it comes to children, there's been much less of that, and in particular, much less recognition that it's not just a gender issue, but it's also an issue about ethnicity and poverty. And we know from adults that people living in deprived areas are, sort of 3 times more likely to end up in hospital compared to people in the least deprived areas. And that similarly with deaths, they're 2.5 times more likely to die from COVID than in the least deprived areas. And we know for Black and Asian groups that the risks are much higher than their white equivalent counterparts. So it seems very strange that that hasn't been taken into consideration. And with Black and ethnic minority children in particular, they're much more likely to be under the age of 18. So if you're from a mixed ethnicity group, half of the mixed ethnicity group are under the age of 18. A third of Black groups are under the age of 18. A quarter of Asian groups are under the age of 18. So the benefits of vaccinations for those groups who are much more exposed to the virus because of where they live, because of their type of housing and so on, would be much greater. But it seems that JCVI have ignored that.
Thank you, Zubaida. We have a question from Dr. Siobhan Crabb too, along similar lines. So Dr. Crabb.
Hi, I'm just struggling to get my video on. I don't know if you can put it on for me.
Any of the tech guys do that? Or if not, then just tell us your question anyway. Yeah. Oh, there you are.
There we go. I've appeared. Yeah, I think Deep kindly answered a little bit of my question, which was about, was there any evidence for a single dose in teenagers? And going with your answer that there doesn't appear to be much evidence that there's good protection from a single dose, could I just ask what protection you do think then that 12 to 15-year-olds might get against Delta from a single dose of the vaccine as a mum of a 15-year-old boy?
Sorry, I'm not sure if that's to me, but
I think it might be to you, Deepti.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's very hard to say. So I think JCVI have said, or rather, I think the CMO said that they expect a protection of about 55% from infection. I think that's what they've based their modeling on. Of course, the protection from severe disease would be expected to be much higher. The question, of course, is the durability of that. And the durability will depend on a number of things. I think children, we've had a question about with past infection might have a longer durability of immunity because they've already had one infection. Having said that, the current data suggests that the majority of children are not actually immune. So even if they've been exposed, they don't seem to have antibodies. And even if they have antibodies, they may not have them to Delta. So I'm sorry, I'll just have to say that I don't know the answer to that, but I think that they should really limit the uncertainty on that by giving 2 doses, because that's the only way that we can be sure that they will have a high degree of protection, because otherwise it's frankly just guesswork.
Would anyone else like to add to that?
Yeah, it's Anthony here. Just to say, Stanley Plotkin, who's a very senior vaccinologist in the United States, said we should stop talking about boosters because this is a 3-vaccine issue, 3-dose issue. You know, I mean, when we immunize, as Dr. Crabb knows, for diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, polio, we give 3 doses in order to boost up and have a durable immune response. And Plotkin feels this is the same for this. And indeed, we may need subsequent boosters after that. So I think if we're treating 12 to 15-year-olds the same as the adult population, some vaccinologists, I don't know whether Deenan and Daris would agree, are saying, look, prepare for a 3-dose schedule. We can work out the timing of it, but that's what we're going to need to get. And the evidence is that the 3rd dose gives you a much bigger push certainly into your antibody levels. Whether it affects T cells and stuff is another issue.
Does anyone else want to comment on the 3rd doses becoming part of the schedule? Yes, Susan.
Well, just on terminology, my understanding, I might be wrong, but my understanding was that 3 doses is used to refer to the situation when you're trying to get the immunity level up to a certain point, whereas the booster is used in situations where the immunity has been got up to a certain point, but is then waning over time and going down. It is confusing when different people are using the same terminology in different ways. So it would be really helpful if we knew if there was a kind of consensus on this terminology.
Okay, Deenan.
I'm not a vaccine immunologist, and so, but my assumption, Anthony, in response is that for some vaccines that you give 3 times is because they're different antigens being used, and it's about getting a response in the same way that, you know, that was for polio with the 3 types, and DPT is within diphtheria, pertussis, you know, tetanus. So I don't think there's anything magic about 3, to be perfectly honest, and who knows with regard to coronavirus immune responses anyway, because we have not had a vaccine before. So I think just the issue we've come across at the moment, this is my perspective, is that boosters are being used because clearly we've got some individuals who've not responded very well, immunocompromised, and that is, you know, that's a very reasonable thing to do to boost immunity. We also know that antibody levels do come down after 2 doses, and there's some interesting data, I think, going to be coming out both from ONS. I think there's a preprint already from ONS, and also the Virus Watch study, prospective studies, which do demonstrate, well, where it's still uncertain. I think the jury's out, I would say, as to whether, you know, antibody level is associated with protection or not, but that's the assumption that is being guiding boosters. And of course, lastly, you know, it is now getting on to, you know, 6 to 9 months since some individuals have had their 2 doses. So, but I'm just not sure there's a magic about 3 doses with regard to this vaccine.
Thank you, Deenan. Let's move on to some more questions in the audience. Russell, are you there?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Hey, sorry, I just can't get my video up. I'll just ask the question.
Yeah, please do.
There have been trials of sniffer dogs detecting COVID at sport events, airports, and care homes with high reported accuracy. Shouldn't we be training large numbers of dogs to screen for cases at events and public places? Thank you.
Who would like to tackle this? Should sniffer dogs be used to detect cases of COVID in public? Anyone want to have an opinion on that? Everyone's very quiet. Christina, how about you?
So I'm definitely not an expert on whether that works or how well it works, but if there are other ways that we can detect COVID, particularly ways that aren't based on individuals, so things like we know wastewater treatment, looking at that is a really good way of early indicators. So if this kind of thing would work, then why wouldn't you use the tools that you have at your disposal, I guess? I mean, I'm sure, but that's just a snap opinion. It's not, I haven't thought about it for very long.
Fair enough. Dean, any thoughts?
I just big in the absence of other people wanting to answer, I've not seen any good data that implementing this is associated with picking up cases that wouldn't be picked up otherwise. I mean, I know those trials are going on, but if anyone has seen any data, then please bring it to us, our attention. I'd love to see it. So that's all I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, not that anyone else my opinion, but the idea of a false positive of a dog coming up to you and it's being slightly terrifying, especially if you're scared of dogs, might be an issue. It might be one of the issues. I've got a question here from Bob Hamilton as well, which I'll read out. There was a brief report from New Zealand a couple of months ago that paediatricians are reporting an upswing in children presenting at hospitals with symptoms of non-COVID respiratory conditions. In many cases, the symptoms were far more serious than were generally experienced before the pandemic. The phenomenon was called immunity debt, where reduced social contact eventually weakens one's resistance to a range of infections. Where does independent SAGE draw the line between protecting society from specific viruses and increasing the risk posed by previously relatively innocuous viruses? Anyone would take a tackle? That's quite a challenging point, isn't it, Helen? Helen?
Sorry, just managing, trying to unmute myself.
Okay.
I mean, it is a really interesting question, and there's a question of, are we going to get a lot more children presenting with all the coughs and colds they didn't have last year because they weren't seeing anybody last year and they didn't have that? And I think that it's possible that there will be a little bit more. So normally children in their first couple of years of life do have a lot of respiratory illnesses where they meet the viruses, the common everyday viruses, and some of them will have not been having that. Having said that, an awful lot of children have still been going to daycare and have still been meeting other children. So it's not going to happen all at once. And I think we know that children and their parents, particularly in the rest of their families, have suffered from COVID and will carry on suffering from COVID the more that we pass these viruses around. It's possible there may be some slight increases in other viruses that counteract as we meet that, but I don't think it's it's not really a balance. You can say, well, you really ought to get COVID because otherwise you're going to get all these other things. That really doesn't. It certainly doesn't make sense to me as a practitioner. And I have to say, I still haven't seen all those snotty kids in my surgery yet. They haven't come back yet.
Christina, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just on the Indie Sage view, to the extent that this has happened through lockdowns, if it's happened, Indie Sage has never been for lockdowns. We've always been for measures that prevent cases getting high enough that you need to restrict your movements. And so to that extent, we think, had we followed that kind of policy from a year ago and we were pretty much almost at incredibly low levels of COVID, we might not have needed the lockdowns that we've had and the restrictions that we've had and the staying at home that we've had. So I don't think there's any tension between the kind of things we're proposing and having a normal life. So that's what I say.
Thank you, Christina. Gabriel, did you want to add something as well?
Yeah, I just want to add that a lot of the mitigation factors, of course, that would help us prevent COVID-19 transmission will stop with help us stop transmission of other bugs and viruses. That's for absolute sure. And people have tried for years to get really good hygiene regimes going in schools and nurseries and so on to try and reduce transmission. And also, we got to factor into it that what we're seeing this year, again, as last year, very low levels of influenza. The WHO monitoring shows that there is really a very low compared to the expected level of influenza, and that there is no influenza in the Far East so far this year. So I think we should be really optimistic about being able to reduce our overall level of just sort of general infections if we do a lot of the right things that'll help us avoid COVID as well.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I think we're going to have to wrap up the questions from the audience there. Before we go, Stephen, would you like to just tell us a bit about the Independent Sage Winter Plan, just very briefly, because we'll be discussing it further in coming weeks.
Yeah, this is a trailer for next week. I think if there's one thing I suspect we all agree on, it's that we don't want another winter like last winter. And the reason, I think, why we had those terrible times and the severe restrictions is because the government ignored rising infections in the early autumn. On the 21st of September last year, SAGE argued that we should have measures taken to bring down infections, and that was ignored, and it was ignored, and it was ignored. And as a result, things ran so far out of control, we had to have severe lockdown. It actually reiterates the point that Christina has just made. If you have sensible mitigations in time, it avoids lockdown. It's an anti-lockdown policy. And now again this year, almost exactly a year later, on the 8th of September this year, SAGE has argued that unless we take some measures, then we will have 7,000 hospitalizations, which will lead to unbearable strain on the NHS. Now, the good news this year, and again, we've heard about it today, is that due to the success of the vaccines, we don't need as severe measures to bring things back under the control. A combination of the vaccine and protections and support, not restrictions, protections, like making safe environments, will lead us to a place where we can control the virus. But the problem is, again, the government is ignoring it. Its winter plan is so pallid it can't do anything about it. And if we had sensible, limited protections, and I stress protections, not restrictions, we could control things. It's only if we don't, it's only if we let things go rip that we are in danger of having to have restrictions and having another awful Christmas, or rather another non-Christmas. So we have developed a winter plan of sensible and moderate protections, which have been proven in other countries like Denmark and Italy and Singapore to work, and we'll be presenting it in detail next week. So join us next week.
Stephen, thank you very much. And of course, if you want to hear more about that plan, do come along to the meeting next week. So we'll have to wrap up things there. Thank you to our guests, Aris and Deepti, for joining us today for a fascinating and informative discussion. And thank you as well to the scientists on the panel for your continued hard work. Now, you members of the audience, please do send us your questions and look out for our new report on the website. In the meantime, stay safe and keep well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.